Testing on YouTube. Testing on YouTube. 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 Yeah, you really have to speak into the mic. So annoying. Why is mic technology terrible? Buenos dias. Top of the morning. All right. Let's knock that off. Let's spit out our gum. I think we're live on X as well. Let's confirm. Takes a second to get started on X. All right. We're live on X as well, so let's get started. Let's put that away. Let's take a little sip of water. How's it going, Kareem, Oma, Ed? Let's blow our spiral didgeridoo to announce the start of the session. I only kind of know how to make those cool didgeridoo sounds, but I'm working on it. How's it going, Ryan? All right, so welcome to another Hoopo stream. Today we're going to be going into something that's a little bit different from the standard machine learning papers we review, but as we go through this paper, we're going to kind of realize that there's a lot of ideas here that fit in very nicely into the intuition that we have around machine learning and AI and where this is all headed and kind of what some of these ideas mean about the underlying true nature of reality. So this stream is called Collective Intelligence, which is based on this paper here. So we're going to be reading this paper. This paper is a paper published in Nature. So Nature is mostly a biology publication. I don't really read a ton of Nature, right? Most of what I read is machine learning stuff. So the format for this paper is a little bit different, the way that they do figures, but they're still kind of the same basic structure. You got the abstract, you got a conclusion, you got references down here. So there's some familiarity. The reason I learned about this paper is because it's from this guy here, Michael Levan. So Michael Levan is a very famous biologist. I got introduced to him via the kind of podcast circuit. He's been on Lex's podcast. He's been on a variety of different podcasts. He's very good at talking, very good orator. He explains things very clearly, and he has a lot of very cool research. He kind of works on ideas in biology that are a little bit out there, but like in a very interesting, cool way. So you can also look him up on Google Scholar. So this is his Google Scholar page. And if you go over here to the cited by, you can always click here and hit the view all, and then you can see the growth. So this is the number of citations for his papers. You can see he kind of started around 1997, but since then he's really kind of been growing. Look at that. Look at that hockey stick growth right there. And you can see that 2022, 2023, 2024, he's absolutely killing it. Over 3,500 citations a year. So this guy's getting popular, and I want to introduce him to you guys because I feel like his ideas are just so good. And it's a little bit of a blast from the past. So here I have my YouTube page pulled up, and this is all my live streams. And actually, if you scroll all the way down, and you can see kind of the various generations of YouTube thumbnails that I had, and then it goes even older and older. Before I even had thumbnails, when I was doing coding streams, this is when I started having thumbnails. Here, there's no thumbnails. If you go all the way back to the very first stream I did, it's this one here. It's called Biological Robots, which is also a Michael Levan paper. So I don't recommend you watch this stream because it's extremely cringe, and I still hadn't figured out the format. I was trying to do like a top-down where I'm drawing on the paper. It was terrible stream, but the first stream I ever did was a Michael Levan paper, so we're going back to Michael Levan for his newest paper, which is called Collective Intelligence, a unifying concept for integrating biology across scales and substrates. All right. How's it going, Majetti? How's it going, Sam? Oma, Luke, Sam, sir, as someone with mental health diagnosis, how good is it to avoid an ADHD moment? I think you got to embrace the ADHD. I definitely have some amount of ADHD, but use it as kind of a superpower, because contact switching is one of the most mentally taxing things you can do. And there's a lot of people who can't contact switch at all, right? So they can't do one thing and then another thing and then another thing. They kind of quickly burn out doing that. So if you happen to have the brain state where you can contact switch a lot and it doesn't seem to tire you very much, which is what the ADHD kind of phenotype is, use that to your advantage, and you can kind of pursue a more generalist intellectual diet. And I don't know, I've embraced my ADHD, and if you see it as a gift rather than a curse, I think it'll help you in life. Okay, so let's start by reading the abstract here. A defining feature of biology is the use of multiscale architecture. Multiscale architecture here ranging from molecular networks of cells, tissues, organs, whole bodies, and swarms. So you can see here he's basically going from a low-level, kind of very microscopic organization unit of a cell all the way up this hierarchy to the highest level of hierarchy, which is a swarm, of humans or birds or agents or whatever you want to call it. But right off the bat, that type of hierarchical multi-scale architecture is exactly what we see in modern deep learning, right? So I have here deep learning. This is the image of what features look like at different levels of a convolutional net. So a convolutional net is a type of net that consumes images and then does some kind of classification task or some other downstream thing that people want. But if you were to actually inspect what the features, or you could think of it like what is being paid attention to, this is not an attention-based architecture. This is a ConvNet, which is a little bit older than a transformer, but think of it as like what you're paying attention to at the different levels of this hierarchy. So you can see that there's a hierarchy of concepts that is being created, and that hierarchy of concepts allows for intelligence. So right off the first sentence in the abstract, we can already see some parallels from this biology paper to what we do in machine learning and AI. Crucially, however, biology is not only nested structurally, but also functionally. Each level is able to solve problems in distinct problem spaces, such as physiological, morphological, and behavioral state space. So this idea of spaces, right, you've often heard the concept of like latent spaces, which is when you project some high-dimensional thing, such as an image, into a low-dimensional thing, such as a vector, and that vector lives inside some latent space or an embedding inside an embedding space, right? Here, he's kind of using that same word space, but talking about the space of all morphologies. That would be morphological space. The space of all behaviors. That would be behavioral space. So whenever you read a paper that's from a different scientific discipline, the terminology isn't always exactly the same, but it's usually pointing at the same thing. So like they have a different definition of what functions are and spaces and all these different things, but the high level concepts are kind of the same. So usually almost every single scientific discipline, for example, has a different definition of what entropy means. But okay, I'm getting a little distracted here. Percolating adaptive functionality from one level of competent subunits to a higher functional level of organization requires collective dynamics. Multiple components must work together to achieve specific outcomes, which is also what's happening here, right? So you're ultimately identifying this as a car because at these different levels of the hierarchy, these multiple components are working together, right? So in order to recognize at this mid-level feature that you have a circle, right? So this circle here will trigger on the wheel. But that circle feature depends on the coordination of a bunch of earlier features, right? So you might have to detect the edge at the top, the edge at the bottom, the edge at the side, right? So a whole kind of a whole slew of different edge detectors that all form a circle, and then all of those collectively allow you to identify this higher level feature, which is the wheel. And then that wheel is collectively combined with a bunch of other of these mid-level features in order to create the high-level feature of a car. So there's always these hierarchies where multiple components at one layer work together to achieve a specific outcome at a higher level. Here we overview a number of biological examples at different scales, which highlight the ability of cellular material to make decisions that implement cooperation towards a specific homeodynamic endpoints. So he's going to use the word of like attractor states for this. Another way to think about this is the analogy of like a ball rolling on a hill. So here you have in figure 1, you have this landscape. He calls these like spaces, right? So morphological spaces, the space of all body types and body morphologies. So when you're transitioning from an embryo to a full human, another way to think about what's happening is that you're taking some path in this morphological space, right? So you're traversing from some point, which represents an embryo, to some other point, which represents a grown adult human. And that space, here you have some manifold on that space in which you're traversing, there's certain parts that are kind of like deep valleys, and then there's certain parts that are mountains, right? And it's very difficult to go up a mountain. So it's very difficult to grow a third arm because there's going to be all these regulatory mechanisms that are going to kind of try to prevent you from growing that third arm and ending up at the top of a mountain, which might be a human with 3 arms. But the final morphology of an adult human is a very, very deep channel that is very easy to fall into, right? So this idea that you're kind of traversing this space into some final endpoint that is almost there for you to end up in. Implement collective intelligence by solving problems at the cell, tissue, and whole organism level. We explore the hypothesis that collective intelligence is not only the provenance of groups of animals, but is also an important symmetry that exists between the behavioral sciences of swarms and the competencies of cells and other biological systems at different scales. And I think this point here is kind of one of the more interesting points, and we're going to get a little bit, we're going to go high level and ontological with this discussion here, but to me, this is almost like a proof of consciousness for AI, right? And I know that's a mouthful to say, but in this paper, he lays out a very clear argument as to why we have to stop thinking about intelligence as some kind of agentic, like single object kind of thing, where you have some person or some animal that is entirely contained, and then it has some intelligence that's constrained to that entire animal and only exists out of that animal, right? What Levan here is trying to make us think about is that intelligence can be defined at any level of the hierarchy, right? So there's some intelligence at the level of 1 cell, there's some intelligence at the level of 10 cells, at the level of 100 cells, and those intelligences are slightly different. They have different goals, and you can almost apply a lot of the same ideas behind intelligence and agents and all of that at each level of the hierarchy, not just at the specific level of the hierarchy that we do it. Okay, and then the obvious kind of downstream ramification of that is that even though a neural net is just this giant collection of neurons, right, and we can say, okay, well, that's not intelligent, it kind of is, right, because at some level of this hierarchy, it has intelligent behavior, and if it has intelligent behavior, how different is it from a human, right? So if we're just a collection of cells and we have consciousness according to our definitions, then a neural net is just also some collection of little tiny things that are making a collective intelligence, and that should also kind of have some consciousness too. I don't know, I'm kind of stretching there, but hopefully by the end of this stream, you'll maybe agree with me. We then briefly outlined the implications of this approach and the possible impact of tools from the field of diverse intelligence for regenerative medicine and synthetic bioengineering. All right. Embrace the ADHD. There you go. I'm glad that's quoted. All right. So this paper has really nice figures. One thing I found is that it seems like biology papers have like really good figures. So sometimes you read machine learning papers and the figures just kind of suck. You know, they're just like MATLAB plots and tables. But it always seems that every time I try to read a biology paper, they have just like the coolest figures. Like, look at these. These are like very high level graphics and lots of interesting, like most of this paper is honestly just pictures. So we're not going to spend too much time on the text. We're going to try to like center the discussion around these pictures. So here he makes the argument that evolution facilitates the increase of complexity, and evolution works with an agential material. An agential material is a material that's composed of agents, right? So in this case, he's talking about substrate with competencies, or a bunch of cells that are making up this material made of cells, but then each cell has some agent agentic behavior, that each cell is a little agent, but if you consider the behavior of 10 cells, that's also has the behavior of an agent, right? So the analogy to AI is that each little neuron is kind of like an agent, right? Each little neuron is receiving a bunch of signals from other neurons at the lower level, and it's making ultimately some decision with a activation function about whether to fire and then how to fire, how strong to fire, right? Based on whether it's a ReLU or different types of activation functions. So each little neuron has some amount of agency, but then all the neurons together also have agency. And then if you think of all the neurons together forming one neural net, right, that neural net has some agency. But now if you think about multiple neural nets operating together, right, we're already seeing these systems that people are creating where you have multiple language models that are all kind of like acting together to solve a problem, right? So you might ask some question, and then that question gets sent to a bunch of different models who then have their own little chain of thought, and then you have other models that look at those chains of thought and then summarize it for you. So there's no limit to this, is kind of what Levan is saying. You can keep creating a higher level where you just bundle together all the agents at the lower level, and then you're going to create a higher level of agency. Adaptive behavior in new problem spaces can arise because higher levels of organization can deform the energy landscape for subunits while benefiting from their ability to navigate those landscapes autonomously and without micromanagement. So this is also cool, is that as you go higher and up in the level of abstraction, the higher levels of abstraction don't need to understand what the lower levels are doing, right? So in his particular example, he, for example, talks about... here he does a lot of work with these worms. These are called planarian worms or flatworms, I think. And he does all kinds of weird, crazy Frankenstein shit where like he's cutting them in multiple places, and he can get them to grow heads and grow tails and grow heads on both ends kind of thing. But the way that he describes it in some of the podcasts that he's been on is that the signal to grow a head, which is coming from the higher level kind of organism abstraction, is not a very nuanced signal, right? So that signal is not saying, okay, here's exactly what you need to do in order to grow a head right here. The signal that is releasing is just, okay, there should be a head over here. And then it's up to the lower level of abstraction, which is the cells, to actually create that head, right? So not only can we create arbitrarily higher and higher levels of agency by just bundling together agents at one level, but as you go down the levels of agency, the agents in that particular level are competent at only the specific space in which they live in, right? So the highest level doesn't know exactly what the lowest level is doing and requires the information that the lowest level has and the agency that they have at their level in order to implement the plans of the higher level, right? So you don't have to think about your heartbeat, but your heart knows how to do the heartbeat. And then the heart itself isn't even thinking about each individual cell and how it needs to contract, right? So you can just keep going up and down this level of hierarchy. I don't know, kind of a very cool idea. So here he defines intelligence based on William James' definition of intelligence, which is a degree of ability to reach the same goal by different means, i.e. problem solving in changing or novel circumstances, which I think is a pretty cool definition of intelligence, and it really meshes well with this idea of different levels, different spaces for each of the kind of hierarchy. So here in this figure, he has, for example, molecules go together to form organelles, which go together to form cells, which go together to form tissues, then organisms, population, community, ecosystem, biosphere, so higher and higher level of abstractions. And then within each abstraction, there's some specific space that they're traversing, and the ability to end up in the same place, right? If you think of this marble rolling along this landscape, the ability to end up in the same attractor state despite different starting points is intelligence. So if you have a group of 10 cells and they're going to form a head, they're taking some path, and then you block that path. Let's say you put some weird stuff in there and it's preventing the cells from becoming a head in that specific way through that specific path. They'll find another path to create a head. They'll find some other path through morphological space to create the head, which was the goal given to them by the higher level. So that's intelligence, right? So he's saying that even though we don't think of that as intelligence, that is a type of intelligence, that somehow this collection of things can achieve a goal given different circumstances and by different means. Pretty cool stuff. Except for that one paper with the AI-generated mouse taste tumor that got memed on. Okay, apparently there's some mouse tumor paper. I don't know what you're talking about there, South CX, but maybe you can share with the chat. Organizational principles enable not just emergent complexity, but adaptive proto-cognitive systems. Tools, concepts, and approaches from behavioral sciences can be productively applied to understand and control systems far beyond familiar animals with central nervous systems. And this, I liked this sentence because it's also something that we're starting to see as well, right? So even within machine learning and AI, I've seen a bunch of papers now where they use these types of approaches from behavioral sciences to understand language models, right? The idea of prompt engineering, right? At some point, there was that meme where if you tell GPT, I'll tip you $200 if you answer this question correctly, and it actually answers the question correctly more often than not when you tell it that. So that's a trick that comes from kind of behavioral science that can be applied to a neural net, which is a collection of a bunch of neurons. So we don't think of the collection of a bunch of neurons as a single agent that can basically is similar to a human, but it is that, right? It has the same, it's the same type of, you can use a lot of the same tricks that people use for humans for neural nets, and he's kind of applying it specifically to like collective groups of cells. Okay, so he has some examples here. This is one weird part. So this, like, I don't understand, but in this type of paper format, so this is figure 1 right here. And then figure 1, the text for it is on the next page, which is very gross. I don't like this at all. Like, look at this. This is the text for figure 1 is on page 3 along with figure 2. So kind of a weird format. I feel like they should force the text for figure 1 to be on figure, I don't know. I don't know why they did that. But anyways, evolution of complex life forms is a reuse of many of the same mechanisms and strategies across scale of organization. Input layers receive pixel-level information, and then each subsequent layer extracts progressively higher-level features in the image. So I already showed you guys this, which is a convolutional neural net, and the different layers of abstraction there that also form this kind of hierarchy of concepts. But I have a more modern version of that. This is a paper on a vision transformer, specifically Flexi VIT. That the specific vision transformer isn't super important, but this is a type of visualization technique where you have here the logit units. The logit units are kind of at the highest level, and then the right is specific channels located in different blocks. So any vision transformer is going to be a bunch of transformer blocks stacked up on top of each other. So block 1 is going to be the very first block, right? You could think of it like the block that's right here. That's a low-level block that's very close to the image space. And much like a ConvNet basically figures out these edge filters, these vision transformers are also doing that, right? So you can see in block 1, the features or the competency that this hierarchy, that this level in the hierarchy is good at is textures, right? Very high frequency, low level type of features. And as you go higher and higher up in the vision transformer, the features get increasingly more and more abstract. And they're only possible because they have access to the information from this lower level, right? So here you have textures and then slightly more complex textures, and then now you start having shapes and patterns, and then eventually once you get to the logit level, which is kind of almost right before the classification head if you were using this Flexi VIT to do ImageNet classification, you can see for each of the classes, you can almost recognize what's in here, right? So espresso, you can see that there's this notion of like the white rim of a cup with the dark liquid bottle. You see these bottles here, guitar, banana, basset hound, right? Like you can see, you can actually understand these as features of the actual class versus if you were looking at this, it's a little bit more difficult to see, but I don't know. I think this is a very cool visualization. All right, let's go back to the paper. Hupo for president. I don't want to be president, man. The president is a terrible job. That's why everyone who's trying to be the president generally sucks, because Nobody wants to be the president. So the only people who want to be president are like boomers who don't understand that it's a terrible job. Okay. Tadpoles with incorrect arrangements of craniofacial organs still become normal frogs by novel movements of entire complex structures that operate to reduce distance error from current configuration to the normal frog target morphology. I like the way that he framed this, where he says reduce distance error. So that sounds very similar to a lot of the types of losses that we use, for example, in when we're training image encoders or when we're training 3D generative models. We're using what are called reconstruction losses, which are losses that say, okay, this is what it should look like, and this is what it is like. And then there's some error between those, and you can back propagate that error all the way down to the lowest level and change the neurons that are determining what these low-level features are, right? So based on a error that is defined at the highest level, right, where this is a banana, but you said it was a basset hound, so it should actually be a banana. There's some reconstruction error there. I guess classification error is different, but you're taking an error at the highest level of the hierarchy and then going all the way down and using it to change things ever so slightly here. And in the biological case, what he's talking about is that here you have a tadpole that has eyes at the normal place, and then you have here what he calls a Picasso-like tadpole, which is a tadpole where he messed up and now it has an eye kind of on the side of its arm or something like that. So the eyes aren't in the correct place, but ultimately, because they're intelligent, as he was saying before, where the ability to end up at the same attractor state in some morphological space is intelligence if you're capable of doing it despite different starting conditions. And that's what you're seeing here, right? Where even though this guy is messed up and the eyes aren't in the correct place, the signal of like, this is what the frog should look like at the end is able to in some way kind of back propagate all the way to the lowest level, which is I'm an individual little eye cell. Where do I need to move in this particular microsecond so that ultimately way down the road, I'm going to end up at the right place to be the right eye of this particular frog. So there's some kind of equivalent to like a reconstruction loss that is being back propagated down this hierarchical system of biological competencies all the way to the lowest level, which in a neural net might be like the neurons here at the lowest level, but in a biological system, it's literally like, I'm a little cell. Am I moving to the left or am I moving to the right? So, pretty cool stuff. Okay. Collective intelligence expands the perceptual field of a group of cells beyond the capacity of any individual, expanding their problem-solving ability. So here in Figure 2, he's looking at goal directedness. So here he has a magnet, right? Their magnets are north and south, and the north wants to go towards the south, but there's this obstacle in between. So a magnet, I guess, being an example of the stupidest kind of agent, it is incapable of going around that, right? So if his definition of intelligence is being able to reach a goal through different means, I guess he's basically saying that a magnet does not have intelligence because it's not able to change its behavior based on the goal and based on the fact that there's a problem there, right? So then he says, okay, well, intelligence would be the ability to say, okay, well, I want to move to the goal, but I can't because there's this block. So I'm going to move around this block to get to the goal. And that's kind of the lowest level of intelligence you can have, according to him. What he calls collective intelligence is now when you have intelligence that extends beyond the individual perceptual field, right? So maybe this little cell right here, this is one of the eye cells of this tadpole, it doesn't know where it is relative to all the other cells, right? It doesn't have any notion of like the fact that it's part of a tadpole. It's just an eye cell. But ultimately, it has some goal that it wants to move towards. And that goal is only possible to perceive through the collective perceptual field, right? So it has to know where the goal is because of its neighbors. So somehow the information from that goal is propagating through all of its little neighbors, ultimately to the one cell, which is the one that's going to have to perform the movement to get to that goal. So the ability to expand your perceptual field via a collective intelligence is also a type of intelligence. This enables collectives to survey larger spatial areas and expands the capacity of the individual to incorporate information from the past and anticipated future due to the greater computational capacity and broader spatiotemporal perceptual and actuation horizons. Okay, so this last part here, broader spatiotemporal perceptual actuations and horizons. And here you have his version of that. But what he's riffing on here, so this is his riff on what is called a light cone. So in the field of physics, you'll sometimes hear this term called a light cone. And what this means is that here in this figure, this is a three-dimensional figure, so you have X, Y, Z. The X and Y axes represent space. So we're used to space as being a three-dimensional thing, but here it's a two-dimensional thing just to make the visualization easier. So here you have two-dimensional space, and then time is represented on the Z-axis, right? So if you're the observer and you're sitting here at this point in space and this point in time, you can only move at the speed of light, right? So you cannot impact this point in space over here because you just literally can't move there fast enough to impact it. So in terms of the impact that you can have, or the awareness or your perceptual field, like what you can actually change and see and impact, it's based around the speed of light. So if you take the speed of light and create a cone based on that speed of light, that is, in a sense, what is called your cognitive light cone, right? And that cognitive light cone not only extends in the future, but also in the past, right? So you can only be aware of things that were exactly based on the light year or the light speed in the past, right? So you're not going to be aware that the sun has turned off until the light from the sun has hit you, right? If the sun were to magically explode. So the speed of light is ultimately determining like how far back in space and time you can gather information or perceive things, and then kind of how far forward in space and time you can act or perform in, right? So kind of an analogy for this within neural networks would be the receptive field. So in a convolutional neural net specifically, right, there's these kernels that are convolving across, and ultimately different feature levels have a different perceptual or receptive field where they can only pay attention to a certain amount of the image or a certain amount of the input signal. So where was I going with this? So ultimately what I'm going with this is that this idea of a light cone, Michael Levan extends it to the idea of a cognitive light cone, where as a single individual agent, you have a limited amount of space and time that you can pay attention to and interact with and change. But as soon as you start having a collective of things, it has a bigger cognitive light cone. It has a broader spatiotemporal, which is a fancy way of saying space and time, perceptual, which means you can perceive it or you can sense it, and then actuation, which means you can do things or control it or change it, right? So by being a collective, you can act on a larger part of space and time, and that's kind of where ultimately he was going with this earlier comment of evolution works with agentic material, and evolution facilitates the increase of complexity, right? Evolution is this idea that competition and survival kind of drives the complexification of things, and ultimately, in order to better perform actions and better survive in an environment, you need to be able to be aware of a greater part of it and act on a greater part of it. And in order to act on a greater part of space and time, you're going to have to form a collective, and then that collective will have a greater cognitive light cone, and that greater cognitive light cone will endow it with greater survival chances, and thus evolution will select for collectives of intelligence, which is how he kind of says that collective intelligence emerges from evolution. Pretty cool idea. Okay. Perceptual field of an agent, the area in space and time that the agent can survey to find alternative paths to a goal. All right. Let's keep going. Unifying the recent progress in studies of single-cell perception action loops, while the work on active inference and perceptual control theory currently being developed in neuroscience, robotics, and artificial life. So Levan is really kind of making a connection here between all the stuff that we're doing in our fields, such as robotics and AI and machine learning, and all the stuff that people have been doing in biology, where it seems like really there's a deeper scientific theory that underlies both of these, which is the scientific theory of collective intelligences, which is pretty badass, because that might be what we study in the future rather than living at the kind of microscopic level like we do now, where we're just studying a single model or a single convnet. And on the biology side, we're just studying a single cell or a single organ. But it really seems that both biology and AI are really just subfields of a greater field, which is this idea of collective intelligences and how you create these hierarchies of competence and knowledge. Okay. The system consists of subunits all cooperating towards a specific path in morphospace. The cells are committed to making a specific functional anatomy corresponding to one individual. We are noticing alignment. Okay. I think he has one example. I'm going to go back to this. This is also kind of cool. I've never seen this in a machine learning paper, but here in this biology paper, there's this box. So it's like a gray box in the middle of page number 4, and it's just like a little side tangent. It's almost like a little like, hey, here's a random like thought on a thought related but kind of not related to this paper. So I don't know, maybe we need these in ML papers, kind of like little side tangent boxes, papers within papers. We're going to go back to that, but I think this example here of embryos is interesting, so we're going to start with this one. Embryonic blastoderms are considered one embryo, even though they are made of thousands of cells. So a single embryo, this is like the very beginning of a human, right? You just start off as this little bundle of cells. They will all cooperate towards one attractor state in anatomical morphospace. So anatomical morphospace, right, is just the space of all possible morphologies, which is the space of all possible body shapes. And this little group and blob of cells, they're collectively moving towards some point, right? They're traversing around this landscape and morphological space to that one point that they want to get to, which is like an attractor state, right? He keeps using this term attractor state, which is important. I'm gonna use that because I'm gonna go on my own little tangent based on that. Each high-level individual needs to determine the borders between it and its outside world. And what he's talking about here is that there's a particular situation where if you take this embryo, this blob of cells, and you cut it, so you scar it like this, and you basically cut off the connection. So these individual little agents can no longer communicate with the agents next to them. What ends up happening is that each individual little subunit of agents then forms their own embryo. So this is how you get, for example, triplets, right? Identical triplets all started off as one embryo that somehow got cut into pieces, and then each of those took their own space through morphological space to end up as a full embryo, right? So to him, one of the most important kind of parts of collective intelligence is this determination of what is me. Where does the boundary of me end and the outside world begin, right? So it seems like the one of the key parts here is determining where the boundaries are between me and the rest of the world, and that boundary defines kind of the behavior that you're ultimately going to have. So I wonder if there's like analogies there with language models as well, right? Or maybe beyond language models, right? If we're thinking about a bunch of AI agents that are all operating as one agent, right? Like, do they have awareness of where they end and the other agents begin? Do they all kind of see themselves as one agent? Do you have, right? And you start thinking about this for humans as well, right? We humans kind of see ourselves as little individual agents, and we have a very clear boundary of like, this is me, and then this is the world. But then there's also the idea of kind of nation states and communities, right? And those have their own idea of what's inside of them and then what's the world. So again, this idea of hierarchies, and within each hierarchy, you have agents, and each agent within that hierarchy is separated by other agents based on some separation criteria that only makes sense at that level of the hierarchy. Okay. The larger issue of competition between wholes and their parts, the more general feature of multiscale organization in which collective agents bend the energy landscape for their components to exploit the mechanisms towards distinct end. The energy landscape, you could think of it as basically just this surface here, this manifold that is existing in morphological space. Okay. From normal millennium, okay, I'm going to go back up to here. And I'm actually going to take a tangent. So I want to take a tangent on this idea of an attractor state. And I want to bring up some crazy shit. So this is the Wikipedia page for a guy called Terence McKenna. So Terence McKenna is basically like a hippie, you know, he all about taking psychedelics and coming up with all kinds of crazy ideas. But if you've never heard this guy talk, I would definitely recommend listening to him on YouTube. He is extremely good at talking. Very, very flowery language, extremely well-read, kind of seemingly knows everything about everything. And he has a particular rant here that I think combines this idea of an attractor state and also ideas around singularity, which is something that we talk a lot about in the AI space. And here it is. So this is the section that I'm going to read. McKenna saw the universe in relation to novelty theory as having a teleological attractor at the end of time, which increases interconnectedness and would eventually reach a singularity of infinite complexity. So McKenna was seeing that, okay, if you think about all humans together in the space of all human morphology, right, it seems like we're traversing down this path in kind of like collective human space, right? So much like you're moving around in morphological space to some attractor basin that represents a full human adult, right? So the embryo is moving towards that deep basin that is a complete embryo, right? And it's figuring out the path to get to that one basin where it's actually a complete embryo. Humans are also doing the same thing. And there's some attractor, he calls it a teleological attractor, at the end of time that we're all moving towards. So even though we don't even realize it, and that each one of us little humans is just acting as little agents within our level of the hierarchy, which is the hierarchy of, or the level of humans and interactions and relationships and stuff like that, really as a collective organism, it seems like we're funneling towards this attractor state. He frequently referred to this as the transcendental object at the end of time. While describing the model of the universe, he stated that the universe is not being pushed from behind, the universe is being pulled from the future towards a goal that is as inevitable as a marble reaching the bottom of a bowl when you release it up near the rim. If you do that, you know the marble will roll down the side of the bowl, down, 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 until it eventually comes to rest at the lowest energy state, which is the bottom of the bowl. That's precisely my model of human history. I'm suggesting that the universe is pulled towards a complex attractor that exists ahead of us in time, aka the singularity, and that our ever-accelerating speed through the phenomenal world of connectivity and novelty is based on the fact that we are now very, very close to the attractor. So kind of crazy. McKenna predicted that this would be in 2012 because he spent a lot of time in like South America, so he probably read a bunch of Mayan text and like kind of was convinced of that. He died before 2012, so like he never really got to see that his prediction was not 100% correct. I guess Ray Kurzweil beat him on that one. Ray Kurzweil's 2029 is actually a much more accurate prediction of the singularity, but it does seem like directionally McKenna was correct, right? Is that there's this unique position in time, which is somewhere in the future that is kind of, he calls it this tightening gyre, right? Where like everything is being pulled into this gyre, where the connectiveness of all humans via the internet, and then as we have the internet, then we're going to start having AI, which is just further allowing humans to increase the size of their cognitive light cone. All of that together is just increasing the size of our collective light cone to the point that we're barreling towards this point of infinite complexity, which is the singularity. I don't know, kind of a crazy fucking concept, but speculating that when the laws of physics are obviated, the universe disappears, and what is left is a tightly bound plenum, the monad, able to express itself for itself rather than only be able to cast its shadow in physis as a reflection. It will be the entry of our species into hyperspace, but will appear to be the end of physical laws, accompanied by the release of mind into the imagination. So, yeah, I mean, just, I guess, a little teaser on McKenna's ability to string language together in an absolutely insane way, but back to this bio paper. So now that I've finished that aside, let's go to this aside. So this is box 1. The use of the word intelligence and other cognitive systems applied outside of its familiar context of brainy animals immediately raises questions. Might not these terms be misused? Are not morphogenic systems simply following the rules of chemistry? Why anthropomorphize them? You can take this exact same sentence here and apply it to AI, right? This exact same thing is happening in AI, right? Where people are saying, hey, you can't use the word intelligence or consciousness to describe a language model, right? Because a language model is just following a bunch of rules in a computer. All it's doing is it's just doing a bunch of matrix multiplies. Why are you anthropomorphizing these language models, right? So Levan says that actually this is true of everything. So if you use that type of logic, then accept that ourselves included, we're just a bunch of chemistry anyways as well, right? Our brain, we see of ourselves as having consciousness and having intelligence and having agency, but you can also just take us and dissect us and be like, yeah, there's nothing there. It's just a bunch of little neurons and seemingly they're firing together, and there's this collective intelligence at the higher level that is emerging. So thus, there is simply no special human category which one can correctly anthropomorphize as somehow being beyond the laws of physics at its base. Claims of intelligence and other cognitive terms, like all others, must be based on rigorous experiment. So it's almost like taking the materialist worldview and realizing that the materialist worldview was correct all along because we just thought that consciousness was more special than it is, right? Consciousness is just an agency emerging at a specific level of hierarchy. And much like consciousness can emerge for each individual human at the level of hierarchy that a human lives in, at each lower level, you also have consciousness. You also have intelligence. At each higher level, you also have intelligence and consciousness. So a little group of cells, a little organoid, is conscious in some way, right? The same way that a collection of humans, a community or a tribe of humans, is also intelligent and conscious in some way. So rather than approaching these questions of consciousness and intelligence and anthropomorphization from kind of a logical, kind of like historical, almost like formal way, which is what we try to do, we should just approach it based on experiment, right? Kind of the classic scientific way where, and this is what Levan is advocating for, where rather than saying, okay, well, this is consciousness because we've decided that the soul is now consciousness. Okay, well, what is the cognitive light cone of a human? And then what is the cognitive light cone of this group of cells? And then what is the cognitive light cone of this nation state? And we're just going to have different definitions for consciousness at each different level of the hierarchy, which is what he does. And largely, this paper is a series of examples in biology, right? Everything from tadpoles to mice to planarian worms. He's basically showing you that at different levels of the hierarchy in biology, you have agenticness, and you have, thus, consciousness. We propose that attempts to mine the rich toolbox of behavioral science to understand and exploit the capabilities of morphogenic systems will continue to pay off, in many cases, humans. So, pretty mind-bending stuff. We're going to move on here. Okay, so now this is the part of the paper that kind of gets a little bit more narrow, so I'm going to kind of, a lot of this stuff gets kind of hairy. I'm not a biologist, right? So, like, I know some of these words, but I'm definitely not an expert. I don't know what a lot of these, like, melanoma-converted phenotype, over-proliferated melanocyte, like, I'm not going to be able to give you guys more satisfying explanations than your average kind of Joe here, but there's interesting stuff. So, for example, he talks about cancer. Cancer is when cells become isolated from the information structure of the tissue and revert back to an ancient unicellular transcription and behavioral phenotype. So, much like he had the example here of as soon as you separate a collection of cells, they stop being a collection of cells and having this collective intelligence and agency and start having the intelligence and agency within their specific subgroups. So what he's saying is that cancer is a version of this, right? Cancer is basically a little cell that forgot that it's part of a larger organism and has reverted back to its more lower level behavior, which is I'm a little individual cell. Everything inside this cell is me. Everything outside the cell is the world. I'm just trying to look out for my survival. Therefore, I'm going to just try to grow to survive, right? And you can actually see parallels to this in humans as well, right? Where humans operate as part of a collective intelligence, which is a community and then a country and then a world. But individual humans can kind of, much like cancer, become isolated from this structure and revert back to a more ancient type, which is, hey, I'm just a fucking ape and I'm sitting here and I don't want to die, so I'm just going to do what I need to do to survive. So kind of an interesting way to think about that. And as he said here, right, you have to take all those same ideas that you apply to individual humans and then realize that those types of ideas and concepts are applying at every level of the hierarchy. So individual humans deciding to not form part of their community is actually very similar to the way that individual cells don't form part of their larger community, which is cancer. So there's a kind of analogous analogy to cancer and kind of maybe like doomsday preppers or something like that. Cells navigate biochemical state space and face specific decision points at regions of that landscape. This stochastic decision resembles a biased coin toss, but all the tissues of a given animal are linked to the same coin. So here he has some examples with tadpoles, and this is kind of where it gets to the point that I don't exactly know what the fuck he's talking about. He's CAMP antagonist, depolarized CAMP antagonist. I think he's... Here you have wild type hyperpigmented. I think this is a tadpole, and then the pigmentation is the result of a specific pathway, and he's basically saying that you can control that pathway. So this is like almost like a top-down view in morphological space, right? And the morphological space here is projected into a lower dimensional space where you just have 2 dimensions here, which is low, medium, or high amounts of SCRT or 5-HTR1. And depending on the path that you take in this landscape, you'll end up at different attractors. So each of these is a different attractor state, and you just ended up there because you had a slightly different set of initial conditions, right? So that's actually very similar to, for example, when you're training a neural net. Actually, let's do this. Atom neural net gradient. There's a visualization that I show all the time. Yeah, this here. So when you're training a neural net, you're basically doing that, right? There's some space of all possible neural nets that you're moving around in. So when you're pushing gradients, what you're doing is you're changing the weights, right? So you could think of a neural net as a collection of individual neurons, which each have some weight. And the collection of neurons, the weight for each of those defines a morphological space of all neural nets that could exist as part of that collective. So each point in this space is some particular permutation of weights for that particular neural net. And when you're doing gradient descent, what you're doing is you're moving around in that space and finding a attractor state which has very low loss for the given problem that you're doing. So a lot of the way that you move around using the loss in here is with these optimizers, such as atom-based optimizers that have these momentum terms, where if you're already moving in a direction in this neural net weight space, you're going to move in that direction no matter what, right? So there's kind of an analogous situation happening here, where as you're moving around in this morphological space here, in the space of kind of hyperpigmentation versus low pigmentation, there's kind of the equivalent of kind of like the atom momentum as well, right? Where if you change around some of these chemical compounds and the balances of those chemical compounds, you could think of it like if your mini batches that you're putting in there and the momentum terms of your atom, if they're just kind of in the right situation at the right time, you'll kind of take a left turn and then to end up in a different hill or a different deep channel compared to if you did a slightly different thing. So we're all just marbles rolling down hills, is what I'm trying to say. Is there a community among cancer cells in the same tumor? Probably, right? So there's probably some types of cancer which are, I guess cancer, right? There's metastatic cancer, which is like the cancer's everywhere and the cells are just spreading everywhere. And then there's the kind of like a tumor-based cancer where all the cancer is in like one central tumor. But yeah, the type of cancer where all the cells are in one tumor is probably, those cells are operating as if they were one collective intelligence. So there's probably some agenticness to the tumor itself. So ultimately what I'm getting at, Deborah, is that the tumor has a consciousness. Just think about that. Okay. Here we're going into more examples. Here's nice pictures of a ball rolling down a hill, going into an attractor state. Navigation of anatomical morphospace. Cell groups need to make specific decisions about which organ will be built and what shape they must make. It is actually impossible for an anatomical decision like this to be made locally. The cells of the wound must coordinate with the remaining fragment to get information. So what he's saying here is kind of what I said before, but when you cut this planarian worm in half, right, those cells somehow know to make a head. But from the local information that those cells have available, they don't actually know that there's a tail and that they're missing the head, right? They shouldn't know whether they need to make a tail or whether they need to make a head. So somehow that collective knows that it needs to make a head, and in order to make a head, the cells that are right on the edge are being directed by the higher level, which is the organism, in order to turn into head cells, right? And the mechanism of control specifically for this is actually bioelectricity, which is one of Michael Levin's kind of like forte. One of the modalities that binds individual cells into morphogenic collectives is bioelectricity. Fragments possess a difference in resting potential that determines the number of and location of heads. And he figures this out with voltage-sensitive fluorescent dyes. So here in this planarian worm, he controls the voltage pattern. So he puts, I don't know, some kind of magnet on, probably magnet using electricity, so you can control the specific parameters of the magnet. And based on that, he can create a worm that has two tails, a worm that has a tail and a head, or a worm that has two heads. So he sees it as basically there's this kind of gradient within the worm that is allowing those individual cells to say, okay, well, the gradient is pointing that way, therefore I need to make a head that way. So we're all just decompressed vectors? Maybe, I don't know. I don't know about decompressed. The cells must communicate with the rest of the fragment to determine what other structures exist, which way the wound is facing, and decide which path in morphospace the collective will follow. While much single-cell information is available about the pathway controlling stem cell differentiation, the field has not a single model able to make prediction for this scenario because we still lack the conceptual tools and data to understand how collectives of cells make unified decisions. And this is kind of one of the more kind of interesting things to think about that Michael Levan talks about in his podcast all the time, where people have a very simplistic view of biology where they feel like the DNA is the code, right? That's what you're told, that the DNA codes for everything, that every cell knows what to do because it's just the DNA is telling it what to do, right? The DNA is somehow like this giant if-else statement, and it's saying, okay, well, if you're this cell at this point right here, this is what you need to do. You need to become a head cell. But that's not actually the case. The DNA is really only encoding the information for the cell itself. It can really only create that one single cell. And the collective intelligence, the collective behavior that is allowing this worm to then create a head or create a tail, that is not at the level of the DNA. That's at this higher level that we don't even understand, right? It's basically the laws of physics and all that stuff kind of works out in this magical way that whenever you have groups of cells, they create these electrical potentials, and those electrical potentials are directing the path that those cells take in morphological space. So the intelligence is in the medium itself. It's not, the intelligence is not the DNA. It's not that the DNA has hard-coded every single possible thing the cell can do. It's that the intelligence is emergent from the substrate itself, which is a bunch of individual cells, which is a bunch of individual agents. So you don't need to have, if you take 10 language models that each have a certain amount of intelligence and have them operate as a collective, there's going to be a new level of kind of emergent intelligence that comes from that, right? And a lot of people call this kind of connectivist idea where somehow we can take a bunch of little neurons, which are each kind of stupid, and we can understand what each little individual neuron is doing, but when you string a bunch of them together into these giant, deep neural networks where you have layers and layers and layers of neurons, all of them together create something that is more than the sum of their parts, where there's a collective intelligence that emerges from these, and it's not like that intelligence was encoded at the lowest level. It's that intelligence emerges from the collective, which is pretty crazy and trippy to think about, because it makes you think about the kind of fine-tuning argument of the universe, right, where it seems like the universe is just magically correct to allow for everything to happen, right? The fine-tuning comes from this idea that fine-tuning has nothing to do with fine-tuning a language model. So fine-tuning a language model means using a small data set to adjust the behavior of a pre-trained language model. That's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is the fine-tuning argument, which is this ontological idea that the universe was created somehow because a lot of the gravitational constants, the cosmological constant, a lot of these numbers that seemingly are just chosen randomly, the hyperparameters of the universe are seemingly chosen just right. So like they all work out perfectly to end up in this universe that we have now, right? And why is that the case? Well, because their point, the fine-tuning argument is that proves that there's some kind of higher level intelligence, there's some God that's creating the universe. But Michael Levin's point here is that it kind of like it's emerging from that, right? It's not like a top-down form of intelligence. It's like, well, it is top-down, but it's just kind of infinite hierarchies on top of hierarchies on top of hierarchies, and as you keep getting more agents within a bigger and bigger and bigger umbrella, the intelligence of those collective agents gets higher and higher and higher. I don't know if that made any sense. Perturbations targeting the bioelectric control circuit. Competition in DNKIR6 injected animals. I don't know what that is. A number of collective decisions are mediated by bioelectric signaling, coordinating neurons in the brain towards the emergence of a coherent problem-solving self. Cells will often recruit their neighbors to help them complete the task. This recruitment of individuals to accomplish a high-level goal is seen in other collective systems like ant colonies. And this brings to mind the quote that I used to tweet about this stream, which is a really cool quote that I love, and it's the hive knows things that the ant does not, right? So even though we think of an ant as the individual unit of consciousness and agency, the hive itself, the hive of ants, is also conscious in some way and also has agency. And the goals that the hive is operating under are not even immediately clear to the ants. And the ants, when they're sitting there and they're trying to pull this little grain of rice and they recruit their little buddy to come help pull that grain of rice, what was the signal there, right? It was the ant telling its buddy to help it pull the signal of rice. But framed a different way, you could think of it as the hive ordering both ants to bring the grain to the hive, right? So where is the goal coming from? The goal isn't coming from anywhere, right? The hive isn't sending a signal to the ants and telling them exactly what to do. It's almost like the goal is just emergent from the collective intelligence of all the ants together, which is kind of a mindfuck. Here he has another example. Wasn't expecting a Terence McKenna video. Yeah, I do. Terence McKenna is just great. Like, granted, it's not like machine learning or AI. It's not like particularly technical content, but like this dude he's so good at talking. Like listening to Terence McKenna on 2x speed feels like I'm downloading the universe source code. All right, so here Michael Levin's talking about another type of situation here. He's talking about ectopic eyes. So this is a tadpole, and he's growing an eye here on the side of the tadpole. Ectopic eyes can be produced in frog embryos, even far from the anterior neuroectoderm, which I guess is probably the part here, anterior neuroectoderm. Ectoderm means outside of the skin. Neuroectoderm probably means the outside of the skin on the front of the head. And then anterior neuroectoderm probably means the outside of the head. So I guess ectopic eyes produced in the anterior neuroectoderm just means that the eye is being put on the head. So he's able to produce eyes not on the head. And he does this by a microinjection of potassium channel mRNAs that induce a specific state that is interpreted by cells as the eye induction signal. However, this does not always work because the surrounding cells in a cancer suppression mechanism are meanwhile exerting influence to shut down the ectopic eye induction, and sometimes no eye tissue appears at all. So this is kind of an interesting thing because it brings into mind this cancer analogy, right, where it seems like the collective has the ability to push down on the agency of the individual. So even though collective intelligences emerge from a bunch of individual intelligences, the individual intelligences will, as in cancer, sometimes spin out and be like, well, I want to be my own thing. But then the hive mind pressures down on them and forces them to conform to be part of this greater hive mind, which you see in human societies as well, right? Where standing out and choosing to be kind of the cancer equivalent, or like saying, okay, well, I'm going to be my individual little intelligent agent. The community hive mind is going to put pressure on you. It's going to force you to conform, to be a job, fulfill some purpose that you're supposed to be fulfilling for the greater collective intelligence that is the community. Yeah, so the increased positional memory and resistance to neighbor effects suggest that cell collectives have an expanded perceptual cone in the posterior time dimension. So expanded perceptual cone in the posterior time dimension, what he's saying is that an individual cell has a certain past light cone, right? It has some certain history that it can observe, but the collective has a much larger past light cone. So an individual cell might only have been born yesterday, so it has no idea about what happened before, but it's living within a tissue or a collective intelligence of cells that might be much older. And those cells were born in a collective tissue where there was even older cells. So the memory of past inductive cues is much, much longer for this collective. And you can actually think of the same thing in humans, right? So even though I have never participated in any kind of like war or combat, my parents and their parents' parents and their parents' parents and human collective, the human community as a whole, has that memory of war, right? So we already have that memory of war, and we know it's a bad idea because the collective memory of the human species is much longer than the collective memory of an individual human. So the society has that collective memory, so it can have this pressure to force you into specific productive outputs for the collective whole based on events that you weren't even old enough to realize. Cell level behavior is subordinate to the collective level behavior. What else? Here we have more examples. Here he's talking about like cells moving and then basically cells being aware. So similar to the idea that when you go to the goal and then the goal is cut out, the cell can basically do something that is negative to its own outcome, but good for the collective. Demonstrates collective intelligence by placing the goal of the individual and the goal of the collective in opposition. And this is done via oscillatory gene expression waves manifest as outwardly propagating rings that successfully affect segmentation on the outer edge of the X-plant. So gene expression, the genes that are coded in your DNA, there's a layer on top of that called the epigenome, which you can think of it kind of like on-off switches for the genes. So gene expression refers to like which switches do you have on and which switches do you have off. And oscillatory gene expression waves means that there's specific switches that are going on and off on your epigenome of one specific cell, and that wave in the kind of cell space is propagating out. So there's one cell that changes a gene, and then it forces its neighbors to switch that gene, and then the neighbors of the neighbors switch the gene, and then the neighbors of the neighbors switch the gene. So there's this kind of like oscillation pattern, and that propagates out within this agentic material. And here you have the oscillations going through. The grafted cells benefit from the expanded memory and predictive power of their neighbors to determine their correct position. So this is the idea. You can take cells that don't have any idea of the memory or the history of a particular collective intelligence, put them in that collective intelligence, and now they will have that memory. So maybe you could think of it this way, right? Like if you took a human and then put them in some kind of hunter-gatherer group, right? That hunter-gatherer group, maybe 100 years ago, one of their members like tried to eat a certain type of mushroom and died. And even though that person is long dead, all the members of that particular hunter-gatherer group have that historical memory, right? The collective memory of that community is encoding the information that this particular mushroom is going to kill you. And you can take a new human who's never been part of that community, put them in that community, and they will now have that intelligence, right? That you shouldn't eat those mushrooms. So communities act as a way of increasing the cognitive light cone of agency, which allows you to make better decisions. So you can have more intelligence the bigger your community is, which is why, as he said at the very beginning, evolution works with an agential material and facilitates the increase of complexity via the collectivization of intelligent individual agents into even larger intelligent individual agents. Here's a kind of an interesting little section here. So he talks about intelligence in bacterial communities, where we often think of bacteria as just like little individual stupid little cells that each have their own little thing, and they're all just, there's no coordination happening there. But he actually noticed that they do that. Bacteria exploit electrical signaling across space and time to coordinate. So they use this bioelectricity And this bioelectrically coordinated oscillatory growth pattern is seen in these bacterial films. Bacterial cells intelligently adjust their individual physiologies to achieve an optimal collective physiology. So even though each individual bacterial cell just wants to survive to the next day, they're going to submit to the will of the collective bacterial biofilm, because the collective bacterial biofilm is more intelligent than the individual bacterial cell. So there's always this kind of like push and pull between individuation and like an individual little agent doing what it thinks it's best versus the community of those little individual agents having a much larger cognitive light cone that allows them to take better decisions, and they do that by forcing that onto each individual agent. And just because I've been looking at a bunch of text, I pulled this up. This is a experiment that these Japanese researchers did where they put a little bit of mycelium. So mycelium is the kind of like, you could think of it like the proto stage of fungus. So it's not bacteria, it's like the mushroom. It's like what's underneath the mushroom, basically. The mushrooms that you eat are just the fruiting body. So the mushrooms that you eat are just basically like the fruit, like the apple. But the actual core part of the mushroom is this mycelium. And this mycelium grows outwards, right? In these kind of oscillatory exploration patterns. And they put food in this area. This is the area of Tokyo. And they put food where all the stations are. And the mycelium grows. And the way that it grows, it creates connections between all these different food places that end up resembling the actual Tokyo rail system. So Tokyo, very big city, has these trains that connect all these different stations, and the collective intelligence of humans over 100 years decided on a specific connectivity within these areas, and the slime mold in 26 hours also decided on some connectivity. And it's interesting that the collective intelligence of a bunch of little mycelium units, I don't know what the individual cells in a mycelium are called, is very, very similar to the solution or the attractor state of a bunch of little humans operating in a larger community. So again, just another parallel that a lot of the you can use experimental evidence from mycelium and the way that they, a community of mycelial cells, the way that they exhibit a cognitive, collective intelligence. You can use that and apply that to trying to predict the behavior of a collection of human agents or a collection of language models. All right, I think that's pretty much it. Let's read the conclusion. The emerging field of diverse intelligence, discovering a vast spectrum of problem-solving capacities and novel substrates and at unconventional spatiotemporal scales. Life is a multi-scale competency architecture. A fundamental aspect of intelligence is collective behavior. All intelligences appear to be made of parts, connected by mechanisms implementing policies that bind the competent components into a cooperative computational medium that solves problems in new spaces and at higher scales. So this solving problem at new spaces. So it seems that life, and not just life, but literally all matter in our universe, is following this same pattern over and over and over again, where individual little things, whether it's electrons, molecules, they're organizing into a slightly larger thing because that slightly larger thing has a slightly larger cognitive light cone and can solve problems in higher spaces, higher scale. So one way that people argue this is that, okay, it's all about energy minimization. So it's like the reason molecules form together is because they're in some landscape of energy, and then to bond it together, they basically exist at a lower energy state. But that traversal from two individual ions into one molecule, right, that happens despite a bunch of different initial conditions. So you could think of the fact that they all end up in the same pit in this molecule space, I guess, which means that there's some intelligence to that. So you can just keep applying that concept kind of infinitely. And it seems that as soon as you can create a higher level of abstraction, a higher collective intelligence, that higher collective intelligence will emerge so that it can move in its own state space into some attractor state of that state space. Another hallmark of collective intelligence is the ability of higher level agent to make decisions based on extended patterns of information. the larger the collective intelligence, the more back in time it can pay attention to. You can think of it like the longer the context is. How higher order entities distort the energy landscape for their subunits, benefiting from the competencies to navigate spaces of which the subunits are unaware. So the highest levels of the abstraction don't need to worry about how to implement the lower levels, don't need to worry about how to implement the lower levels, right? So you're not thinking about what each individual cell in your brain is doing. And each individual cell in your brain is not thinking about what each of the individual carbon atoms is doing inside that. So there's a separation at each of the hierarchies and their competencies. Living matter is a kind of agential material with the ability to propagate information across scales, a phenomenon which has many implications for evolution and for bioengineering and for AI, right? Because AI is fundamentally just this exact thing. You're just taking a bunch of neurons and then making them deeper, adding hierarchy and adding more of them and more of them. And then, okay, so now we took a bunch of multi-layer perceptrons and then we put them inside a transformer, and then we took a bunch of those transformers and then put a bunch of transformers together in a giant stack, and now we have a language model. Okay, well, now we have a language model. Now we're going to have that language model, and we're going to combine it with a bunch of other language models in order to have kind of this ensemble of language models. Okay, well, now we're going to have this ensemble of language models, and then we're going to put it into an agent, and then we're going to have that AI agent, and we're going to have a bunch of other AI agents and wrap it all together into an even bigger AI agent. So that pattern is just going to keep going on and on and on and on forever until we, as Terence McKenna put it, ultimately reach what he calls the teleological attractor at the end of time, where it's some kind of singularity where the entire universe is connected into this larger collective intelligence that achieves some kind of goal in some space that we don't even understand, right? We don't understand what the space of goals of that higher level thing is. So much like we kind of don't understand the space of goals of nation states, right? So the collective intelligences of nation states, they're trying to go to specific attractor states in those, right? Whether it's like world dominance or getting this piece of land or getting this resource. And as an individual human, it's actually very difficult for you to understand what the fuck they're trying to optimize for, but you're optimizing for things only in your level of competence. And then below you, right, your stomach cells are optimizing at their little level. So everyone is really just optimizing at their own little layer of the hierarchy. Okay. Understanding how evolution works in an agential multiscale material will nicely complement the efforts of engineers to build and control swarms of robots and AI systems, but who has yet largely worked with passive matter where competency exists only at one scale? At some point, that's going to be a new job, you know? It's not going to be person who programs an AI system. It's going to be person who programs a collective agent system, which is kind of crazy to think about, right? All right, let me pull my head up. So will these collective swarms of agents eventually evolve into AGI? Yeah, well, the answer to that beyond is that I already think we have AGI. I think ChatGPT was AGI, you know? The G in AGI stands for general intelligence. I think the fact that a single model can write a haiku and then also talk about psychology and then also write code, right? The fact that a single language model is capable of doing basically every single task, to me, that fulfills the definition of general intelligence, right? I think we've already accomplished the Turing test. So I feel like we already went past the AGI and the Turing test benchmarks. But what people have done is they've kind of moved the goalpost forward. And now I think what most people say when they talk about AGI, they're talking about some kind of agent. So I think we're very close to that. I think if you just take a very strong language model, maybe a collection of language models, and then wrap them in basically like a while loop, where it's just doing a thing, then analyzing, then doing a thing, then sense, plan, act, right? This robotics while loop, where you sense, then you plan, and then you act, and then you sense, and then you plan, and then you act. I think that is probably what people mean by AGI now, where they want something that feels like it has like agency, right? They don't just want like a language model that can kind of do whatever. It's very general, but they want that agency part of it. So, yeah. I think ASI will be some kind of collective intelligence if you don't already think of language models as a type of collective intelligence. Language models are a kind of collective intelligence, right? They're basically just these hierarchies of just little individual neurons that are firing. And the trippy thing to think about is that we're a collective intelligence. We're just a bunch of little neurons firing that somehow end up creating this kind of illusion of agency and consciousness. All right. So here's the real secret, guys. I'm actually kind of sick. I don't know if you could tell from the stuffy nose, but I'm going to summarize this paper. So if you guys have any questions, feel free to ask them. If not, I'm going to summarize this and then give you guys back some time. All right. Okay, here's the summary. So today, we reviewed the most recent work of Michael Levan called Collective Intelligence, a unifying concept for integrating biology across scales and substrates. This is the latest work of Mr. Michael Levan, who is a, wow, I think I closed his tab. All right, but he's a very famous biologist. You should definitely listen to his podcasts. I don't think he has his own podcast. I think he just appears on other people's podcasts, but the guy is very good at explaining things, and I would definitely recommend him. And in this paper, he basically presents a bunch of scientific evidence, experimental evidence, that intelligence is not a property of a single kind of agent in the way that a mouse is or a cat, right? There's a brain, there's a whole like agent. You can wrap it. You can say this is the beginning of the cat, this is the end of the cat, and this cat has some intelligence. Intelligence is much more fuzzy than that. And intelligence, he's arguing, exists at many different levels, right? So intelligence exists at the level of a cell, at the level of a group of cells, at the level of a group of cells becoming a tissue, an organism, which is a group of tissues, and then a group of organisms, which is a population, a group of populations, which is a community, a group of communities, which is the ecosystem, a group of ecosystems, which is the biosphere, and then you could even say a group of biospheres, which is the universe, right? So he's saying that at every single one of these levels of the hierarchy, you could find clues and evidence of agency, and you can also find clues and evidence of intelligence. So what he's trying to argue here, with biology as kind of the example, because he's a real scientist, right? So to him, it's like you need to have claims of intelligence must be based on rigorous experiment. So he's showing you a bunch of evidence that consciousness, agency, intelligence exist at every level of this hierarchy, where here's an example of intelligence and consciousness at the group of individual cells, right? With cancer, where in cancer, individual cells have specific goals that they want for themselves. But then tissues, right? Groups of cells, these blobs of cells that are embryos, kind of collectively decide how to look and end up in a specific point in morphological space, which represents a full, complete embryo that will then grow into a full, complete human. And seemingly, there is this kind of top-down goal-directedness where the collective of cells has some specific goal, and it's enforcing those goals based on the individual action of individual units. So each little individual is somehow being told what to do by a higher level entity, but there's no direct link, right? And that's kind of the whole trippy part of this, is that I talked about it when I was talking about ant colonies, where the hive is not explicitly forcing individual ants to go here and then go here and then you go here and then you go here and then you bring back this and then you go help that. There is no hive mind that's actually telling each individual ant what to do. But collectively, all the ants together have this emergent intelligence that seemingly has goals that exist at a higher plane of existence that the ants are unaware of. So this idea, which he calls collective intelligence, goes beyond just ants and cells and embryos. It applies to everything. It applies to humans, and humans are basically operating and doing individual actions on the goals of their whole community. So the whole community has some goal. The whole nation state has a goal. The whole universe has some goal. And that goal is being propagated down into the individual units that are then doing what needs to be done. And crazy fucking shit. I don't know. That's all I got to say about that. But what else? I showed some examples of different levels of hierarchy within machine learning and AI, which is what usually we read, but this type of stuff exists in ConvNets and in vision transformers, where the highest level of the hierarchy is trying to perform a classification, such as correctly classifying an image as a banana or a basset hound. But it can't actually do that, so it's forcing that goal down into the lower levels of the hierarchy, all the way to the lowest level, where at some point, some neuron at the very first layer of that vision transformer is deciding to pay attention to a specific type of texture. And that neuron doesn't really understand the goal of the highest level of like, hey, I'm going to classify into basset hound and banana, but it's getting some goal which is propagating all the way down, and then it's figuring out how to solve that little problem in its competency, which is the very lowest level of visual features, which is this like these kind of like edges and textures. And what else? I think the other kind of core idea here is that individual cells and individual agents, I'm just going to start using the word agents. Individual agents have some cognitive light cone where there's a limited part or segment of space and time that they can use to perform actions. They're only aware of a certain amount of space and a certain amount of time. And this is a kind of riff on a idea in physics of a light cone, which is based on the fact that because the speed of light prevents you from seeing anything outside of the speed of light and inside and affecting anything that's further than the speed of light from you, that means that there's a limited cone in the universe in which you operate. And Michael Levan takes this idea and says, okay, well, that light cone is specific to an agent, but if you have a bunch of little agents that form this collective larger agent, that agent actually has a larger light cone, cognitive light cone, than each individual agent put together. And because of that, the larger cognitive light cone is going to allow it to perform more advanced, more nuanced, more higher level goals. Because it has that much larger light cone, it can perform goals that each individual agent will never be able to perform by itself. And when you can perform higher level goals, you can survive better and you can reproduce better, which means that evolution will select for that. So evolution is forcing each individual agent to collect into these larger agents, and those agents will then collect into even larger agents, and so on. And I don't know, I guess where I'll end this is with McKenna, since you guys liked it, but it seems that humanity as a whole has some attractor space that it's moving towards, where it feels like we're operating at the human scale, and there's specific goals that we want for our lives and specific things that we're doing, and we have agency within our level of the hierarchy. But at the level of the hierarchy of the human population, every single human put together, combined with artificial intelligence, that agent, that consciousness, which is all of the little individual agents put together, all of the AIs put together with all the humans, that agent is seemingly moving towards some attractor state in its level of hierarchy that people are calling the singularity, or the point of infinite complexity, which is where we will release our mind into the imagination. So look forward to that. I don't know. Hope you guys like that. I'm tired, but tomorrow we will be back to more normal material. So if you're interested in Gaussian splats, vision language models, and I think Jamba is a language model, but all three of these, Gamba, Jamba, and Cobra, use a Mamba, which is a new type of architecture similar to a transformer, but different in very many different ways. And we're going to be doing a little summary of these things. So kind of back to our normal programming tomorrow, if you're interested in that. If not, I hope this talk of collective intelligences was interesting, and maybe it gave you some cool ideas. And thanks for that. Thanks Beyond, Majetti, Deborah, SouthX, Doko, Docworld, Pratik, Snooks, PUBG, who else? SouthX, Seth, Cephalus, Aries Aurelie, Matthew Roman, Kareem Habashi, Luke, Oma, Sam, Ryan, Ed, Kareem, Beyond. Thanks, everybody, for listening. Hope you had a great time, and see you guys later.